What's going on, YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, you are watching a Maverick Conservative, where I actually give commentary on politics and I react to pop culture and more. Today, we're going to be diving into the world of Thomas Sowell and why he believes that reparations will never happen.
Something moved in the California legislature calling for formal reparations to African Americans. How do you respond to that?
One, I know and they know it's not going to happen. So what we're looking at is someone who wants votes or followers, and that this will get them votes or get them followers and finance.
I don't want to pause it and make a comment here like, as soon as we just got started with the video, but what he just said is true. I noticed this a long time ago, which is why I left the Democratic plantation. They show up, they promise our community everything under the sun, and then after they get our vote, when they've gotten to office, they disappear. They throw up the deuces sign on us. They're gone, right? They out of here. That's what they do every single time. And our community been falling for this for the past 60 plus years, right? It's time to wake up and leave. He just told you. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and let this man finish.
But it's not, all it will do is simply tear the country apart.
What we see in the United States in terms of the bad things, you see all around the world. If you were to give reparations to everyone whose ancestors had been slaves, I suspect that you would have to give reparations to more than half the entire population of the globe. Slavery was not confined to one set of races. I suspect that most of the people who were either slaves or slave owners around the world were neither white nor black.
All right, well, I disagree with you here because I actually did a video on this a couple of months back about reparations. And all I'm going to say is this: although I am a conservative, I still believe that, we're owed reparations. We're owed reparations. I'll go ahead and put that video at the end of this as far as the explanation. I don't want to take up too much time from Thomas. I'm going to let this man cook.
I mean, this was a universal curse of the human species.
Africa, the Middle East, Asia, slavery took place everywhere.
And it continued elsewhere long after it was abolished in the Western countries. Right. The other thing, I have a slight sidebar in there on the history of slavery. Mm-hmm. The history of slavery existed all over the world for thousands of years.
This is true.
Among all sorts of people, as far back as the history of the human species goes. It's one of many evils that the left tries to localize.
Race hustlers.
When in fact it is a universal evil. But more than that, as much as slavery is repudiated around the world today, prior to the 18th century, I know of no serious effort to abolish the institution anywhere.
Europe,
anywhere.
Not in Africa, not in the Arabian world.
Not in Africa in the 21st century. When Adam Smith wrote in 1776 that the only place in the world where slavery had been abolished completely was Western Europe.
Okay, Western Europe. I said Europe.
And so this was
as late as the year this country was founded.
Yes. And so the idea that this is something that the United States had that nobody else had, or the other countries that didn't have, it's been estimated that there are more slaves in India than in the entire Western Hemisphere.
You know what? Dig that. This man's cooking right now. Dig that. Why is it that we have such a disdain for this country that we helped build, right? This country was built on the backs of our ancestors, right? I'm talking to my people right now. Right, that's the way it was built, right? A lot of other people too, because the truth of the matter is 75% of whites at the time didn't even own slaves. About less than 25% did at the time. So not even all white people contributed to the slave trade, right? So they were here breaking their back just like we were, right? Well, we had the free labor, of course, right? Which is completely flipped up, right? But why do we not look at other countries that had their slave trade and consider them racist countries? How come we don't look at China and countries in Africa and Arabs and India as racist countries? Why do we villainize America and hold this over her head for so long, even though they've done so much to try and right their wrongs, atone for the wrongs that they've done in the past? I don't understand why that is. If you know, go ahead and write your answer down in the comments. But this man's cooking right now.
And that's before and after Columbus got here. Right. There are various laws and policies that benefit one group at the expense of another.
True.
But I think affirmative action has the distinction of being one that it harms everybody, though in different ways.
I agree with that. Affirmative action to me is, I'm glad it's gone, number one, because what I believe it was doing, it was putting people that look like you and me in a position to where we always have to wonder in the back of our head, did we earn this spot? Will people look at us and realize that, you know, or assume that we got here because of the color of our skin and not because of merit? I'm gonna tell you right now, there's nothing wrong with us people. We can compete just like any other races out there. We don't need no handouts. We're not victims. We can compete. I do not like affirmative action.
And so there's a lot of evidence that there are Black kids who have all the qualifications to be successes in college, who nevertheless are failures because they are systematically mismatched with institutions whose standards they don't meet, even though they may meet the standards of 80 or 90% of the colleges in America. I remember first aware of this when I was teaching at Cornell, and I found that half the Black students at Cornell were on some kind of academic probation. And so I went over to the administration building and looked up the SATs of these students. The average Black student at Cornell at that time scored at the 75th percentile.
That's good.
Which is pretty darn good.
Yes. And so that means that in most colleges in this country, they would have no trouble, and many of them would be on the dean's list.
Not one bit of trouble.
But at Cornell, the average liberal arts student at that time was in the 99th percentile. And when you're teaching the students like that, you teach at a pace that most people of any race cannot keep up with.
Cool.
And it was always complained that I was assigning all kinds of reading, but heck, I'm teaching kids who are in the top 1%. They can keep up with the reading that I'm assigning.
So Cornell was taking very talented Black kids and spending 4 years teaching them to feel inadequate.
Yes, and succeeding at that.
Damn. Cornell was taking very smart Black kids, right? Not purposely, right? They believed they were doing this under the eyes of giving them an opportunity. They had a good heart. But the end result is they were taking smart kids, and for 4 years, they were feeling inadequate. They're not inadequate, so to speak, in that position, yes, because they're not the top 1%. Everybody is not equal. There is no such thing as equal outcome. There's only equal opportunity. And the fact that you didn't have the opportunity to go to Cornell because you didn't make the grade means that you shouldn't be there because of affirmative action. If you can't compete, you can't compete. Now, he said half. So that means that the other half were just fine. They belong there. But because there was affirmative action, they still have in the back of their mind, even though I know I belong here, there are people who are looking at me because of affirmative action who are questioning, did I really get here off of merit? And that's flipped up.
In terms of political leaders, all the incentives politically are for Black leaders to blame all problems in the Black community on the larger society. And that enables them to take on the role of being the defender of the Black community against enemies.
Race hustlers.
Which in turn creates the situation in which many Blacks don't feel that anything that they do is going to help themselves unless it's done politically as a group. That there's no point. I mean, why would you, if you believe what they say, why would you want to knock yourself out in the school knowing that the man is not going to let you get anywhere? One of the most pathetic things I heard in recent years was a young Black man saying that, at one point he thought he would join the Air Force and become a pilot. And then he says he realized that the white man is not going to let a Black man become a pilot.
Bullshit.
And he was saying this decades after the Tennessee Airmen had established their reputation in combat in Europe. But the hopelessness is one of the big products of the race industry. That you have no chance. I remember giving a talk at Marquette, and at the end of the talk, among the questions that was asked, a young Black man got up and he said, "Even though I am graduating from Marquette University, what hope is there for me?" And having gone through college when I was in the 50s, I don't remember any Blacks saying that in the 1950s, when there was a lot more obstacles to overcome than there were when this guy is graduating from Marquette. But you have to produce that kind of feeling in order to serve the interests of those in the race industry.
So these race hustlers, right, and of the Democratic Party, it's like sales, right? You give someone a headache, and then you sell them an aspirin. right? In this case, right, instead of the headache, I'm going to give you hopelessness, right? I'm going to peddle the hopelessness on the front end, and on the back end, I'm going to say vote for me because I have a way out. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like a circle; it never ends, right? And that circle that never ends, that in itself is the Democratic plantation, and we need to leave. We need to leave the Democratic plantation for that shit right there.
Somewhere watching this interview, there's a young Thomas Sowell. There's an African American who's smart and wants to do something with his life. It seems to me we've already got one piece of advice you'd offer to him is stay away from the races industry. Stay away from what advice race hustlers. What advice would you give a young Thomas Sowell? How do you make something of yourself as an African American in America today?
The way anybody else would. You equip yourself with skills that people are willing to pay for.
Boom. Boom. Right there. What is there to argue about? I know there's going to be people who's going to beat me up in the comments about this because they don't like Thomas Sowell. I don't care. You can talk about me, call me whatever names you want. It doesn't matter to me, right? The way that we need to talk to our young sons and daughters that look like you and I, right, is to tell them that there is no mystical powers out there called the white man that's holding them back. If they want to be successful, all they have to do is equip themselves with skills that somebody is willing to pay for. You work hard, you study, learn your craft, master your craft, work hard, show up, then work hard again, and go ahead and make your paper. That's it. Wash, rinse, and repeat. That's it. There are no mystical powers called the white man or systemic racism holding you back and keeping you from doing anything. It's a lie that's been sold by the race hustlers and perpetuated by the Democratic plantation owners. This makes me sick, man. But this man cooking right now.
All right.
Nowhere have intellectuals seen racial issues as issues about intertemporal abstractions more so than in discussions of slavery. Moreover, few facts of history have been so distorted by highly selective filtering as has the history of slavery. To many people today, slavery means white people holding black people in bondage.
Mm-hmm.
The vast millions of people around the world who were neither white nor black, but who were either slaves or enslavers for centuries, fade out of this vision of slavery as if they had never existed, even though they may well have outnumbered both blacks and whites. It has been estimated that there were more slaves in India than in the entire Western Hemisphere.
Really?
China, during the era of slavery, has been described as one of the largest and most comprehensive markets for the exchange of human beings in the world. Slaves were a majority of the population in some of the cities in Southeast Asia. At some period or other in history, as John Stuart Mill pointed out, almost every people now civilized have consisted, in majority, of slaves.
Wow.
When Abraham Lincoln said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong," he was expressing an idea peculiar to Western civilization at that time, and by no means universally accepted throughout Western civilization. What seems almost incomprehensible today is that there was no serious challenge to the moral legitimacy of slavery prior to the 18th century. Christian monasteries in Europe and Buddhist monasteries in Asia both had slaves.
Wow.
Even Thomas More's fictional ideal society, Utopia, had slaves.
Utopia, huh?
Although intellectuals today may condemn slavery as a historic evil of our society, what was peculiar about Western society was not that it had slaves, like other societies around the world, but that it was the first civilization to turn against slavery, and that it spent more than a century destroying slavery, not only within Western civilization itself, but also in other countries around the world, over the often bitter and sometimes armed resistance of people in other societies. Only the overwhelming military power of Western nations during the age of imperialism made this possible. Slavery did not quietly die out of its own accord. It went down fighting to the bitter end in countries around the world, and it has still not totally died out to this day in parts of the Middle East and Africa.
Yeah.
It is the image of racial slavery, white people enslaving black people, that has been indelibly burned into the consciousness of both black and white Americans today by the intelligentsia, and not simply as a fact about the past, but as a causal factor used to explain much of the present, and an enduring moral condemnation of the enslaving race. Yet two crucial facts have been filtered out of this picture. One, the institution of slavery was not based on race, and two, whites as well as blacks were enslaved. The very word slave is derived from the name of a European people, Slavs, who were enslaved for centuries before the first African was brought in bondage to the Western Hemisphere. It was not only in English that the word for slave derived from the word for Slav. The same was true in various other European languages and in Arabic. For most of the history of slavery, which covers most of the history of the human race, most slaves were not racially different from those who enslaved them. Not only did Europeans enslave other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, Polynesians enslaved other Polynesians, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Moreover, after it became both technologically and economically feasible to transport masses of slaves from one continent to another, that is, to have a whole population of slaves of a different race, Europeans as well as Africans were enslaved and transported from their native lands to bondage on another continent. Pirates alone transported 1 million or more Europeans as slaves to the Barbary coast of North Africa, at least twice.
Wait. So he's saying the Africans were enslaving white people at a time in history? That's crazy. Thomas be dropping so much knowledge, man. I mean, I gotta go investigate about that myself. I mean, I trust Thomas Sowell, but for me, my father taught me trust but verify. So I'm hearing what this man is saying, but now I gotta go do some research on my own to kind of validate what he's saying. But I mean, the man is thorough. So North Africans owned white slaves at a point in time? That is crazy to me, man. History, boy. God dang it.
Twice as many European slaves as there were African slaves transported to the United States and to the 13 colonies from which it was formed. Moreover, white slaves were still being bought and sold in the Islamic world decades after blacks had been freed in the United States.
So the Muslims was enslaving white people too? What? Yo, my mind is blown right now. I mean, I'm a big history guy, but I mean, this is blowing my mind right now. I'm sure it's blowing your mind too. Maybe some of you knew this already. Write it down in the comments if you feel like you knew already. But I didn't. I didn't. I was ignorant to all of this. I had no idea that the North Africans and the Arabs were enslaving white folk. That is wow.
What marked the modern era of slavery in the West was the fact that, as distinguished historian Daniel Boorstin pointed out, now, for the first time in Western history, the status of slave coincided with the difference of race. But to claim that race or racism was the basis of slavery is to cite as a cause something that happened thousands of years after its supposed effect. As for the legacy of slavery in the world of today...
Hold up, I got to stop for a second. So what it sounds like he's saying to me is that our ancestors weren't enslaved because they were black. They were enslaved because they were available. I know that sounds flipped up, because it is flipped up. But the objective reality is, if I can remove my emotion from it, it makes sense, right? White people didn't go to Africa to go grab them some black folks because they were black. They got them from Africa because they were available. And the reason why they were available is because the black folk who lived on that continent were rounding up people who looked like them from warring tribes and selling them to people who wanted to buy. It was supply and demand. It had nothing to do with race. Damn. That's deep. That's deep. This man be cooking. That's deep. Wow.
That is something well worth investigating, as distinguished from simply making sweeping assumptions.
Wow.
Too many assumptions that have been made about the effects of slavery on both blacks and whites will not stand up under scrutiny. Back during the era of slavery in the United States, such prominent writers as the French visitor and observer Alexis de Tocqueville, Northern traveler in the antebellum South, Frederick Law Olmsted, and prominent Southern writer Hinton Helper all pointed to striking differences between the North and the South, and attributed the deficiencies of the Southern region to the effects of slavery on the white population of the South. These differences between Northern and Southern whites were not merely perceptions or stereotypes, they were factually demonstrable in areas ranging from literacy rates to rates of unwed motherhood, as well as in attitudes toward work and violence. But attributing these differences to slavery ignored the fact that the ancestors of white Southerners differed in these same ways from the ancestors of white Northerners, when they both lived in different parts of Britain and when neither had ever seen a black slave. Does the moral enormity of slavery give it any more decisive causal weight in explaining the situation of blacks today than it did in explaining that of whites in the antebellum South? There is no a priori answer to that question, which must be examined empirically, like many other questions. The fact that so many black families today consist of women with fatherless children has been said by many to be a legacy of slavery. Yet most black children grew up in two-parent families, even under slavery itself, and for generations thereafter. As recently as 1960, 2/3 of black children were still living in two-parent families. A century ago, a slightly higher percentage of blacks were married than were whites. In some years, a slightly higher percentage of blacks were in the labor force than were whites.
Really?
The reasons for changes for the worse in these and other patterns must be sought in our own times. Whatever the reasons for the disintegration of the black family, it escalated to the current disastrous level well over a century after the end of slavery, though less than a generation after a large expansion of the welfare state and its accompanying non-judgmental ideology. To say that slavery will not bear the full weight of responsibility for all subsequent social problems among black Americans is not to say that it had negligible consequences among either blacks or whites, or that its consequences ended when slavery itself ended. But this is only to say that answers to questions about either slavery or race must be sought in facts, not in assumptions or visions, and certainly not in attempts to reduce questions of causation to only those which provide moral melodramas and an opportunity for the intelligentsia to be on the side of the angels. Just as Western Europeans in post-Roman times benefited from the fact that their ancestors had been conquered by the Romans, with all the brutality and oppression that entailed, blacks in America today have a far higher standard of living than most Africans in Africa.
I can hear the race hustlers right now. I know some of you right now are squirming in your seats, hating this man, all emotional, right? All he is saying is that although that horrible history happened to our ancestors, right? Our lifestyle now is far better than what it would have been had we stayed in Africa. You don't have to agree with me. You can look at Africa now, which has made great strides. You know, my wife is from Africa. You know, there's lots of countries over there that are starting to come up, but it's still not America. And you can't sit there, as emotional as you may be right now, if you just look at it objectively, right? We are the poorest, richest people in the entire world. You sitting there, you got a house, an apartment, you got food, you got running water, electricity, and you got a flipping iPhone with Jordans or whatever you like to wear for the ladies. That ain't available over there like you have it here, right? So if you can just sit and objectively look at that and say, okay, he has a point. He's not saying that we benefit. I mean, no, slavery was a good thing. Look at how we're doing now. That's not the overall point. All he's trying to say is, although that happened, right, we wouldn't be in the situation that we are right now as people, as black people, had that not happened. And I know that sounds flipped up, but like, take your emotion away from it. I'm happy I'm here. I'm happy. I would not want to be over there with the Hutus and the Tutsis right now. That was horrible what happened to those folks over there. Absolutely horrible. I'm so fortunate that my son didn't have to grow up like that, right? And I know you are too, and which is America is so great. That's why everybody's trying to come here, right? So don't get emotional. Just take in what he's saying, right? And let it process.
As a result of their ancestors being enslaved, with all the injustices and abuses that entailed. There is no question that both conquest and enslavement were traumatic experiences for those on whom they were inflicted, nor is either morally justified by whatever benefits might come of this to subsequent generations of their offspring. But history cannot be undone, nor does conceiving of races as intertemporal abstractions have any such track record as to make it look like a promising approach to the present or the future.
All right, guys, that's all I've got for this segment. Make sure you get over to Thomas Sowell TV and check out the rest of their works. Fascinating channel with a brilliant man with a beautiful mind who's just so knowledgeable. I'm happy to be able to look up to somebody like that and say that, you know, that's a role model for me. You know, I strive to learn. I'm a lifelong learner. I want to learn every single day, right? Man, what an amazing man. I'm going to leave the link to their channel, to his channel over in the bio box here. Guys, I'm telling you, make sure you actually get over there and check out his works. I'm also going to leave a link in the bio box for another reaction video that I did about a civil rights activist giving his opinion about reparations. It's very eye-opening, and I implore you guys to go ahead and check that out. A lot of great information being delivered in that. The other video I'm going to leave in the bio box down there for you is another video by Thomas Sowell, and it is the hidden truth, or the truth. I can't even speak. The truth behind the hidden truth behind the end of slavery. Man, that was a mouthful. I couldn't get that out. If you like this type of content and you want to see more like it, make sure that you like this video. Make sure you comment on this video. Make sure that you actually share this video. It's the only way that I know that we can force YouTube's algorithm to push this content out to other like-minded individuals. So until I see you on the next video, I am gone.